The observation deck of the Imperial starship Eternum stretched before him like a cathedral of glass and stars. Marcus stood at the viewport, his reflection ghostly against the infinite darkness of space, watching the Andromeda galaxy rotate slowly in the distance. He had been on this ship for 3 weeks now, serving as the newest medical officer in the Empress's private fleet, and he still couldn't quite believe it was real. The station had been routine at first. A simple transfer assignment, they'd said. Serve the Empress for 6 months, maintain her health, and you'll have enough credits to retire on some peaceful colony world. But routine had transformed into something far more complicated the moment she had summoned him. Empress Celestina ruled over 40,000 star systems, commanded billions of lives, and had been alive for more than 2,000 years. Everyone knew this. Everyone also knew that she ruled from isolation, that she spoke to her council only through holographic projections, and that no one had been in her personal quarters in over 3 centuries. The rumors about her were legion. Some said she had lost her humanity long ago, consumed by the weight of absolute power. Others whispered that she was barely human at all anymore, some kind of artificial intelligence given flesh, or a consciousness preserved in a cloned body indefinitely. The most sympathetic accounts suggested she was simply exhausted, a being who had lived so long that emotion had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Marcus had heard all these stories before accepting the position, and he had dismissed them as the idle speculation of people who couldn't possibly understand what it meant to carry the responsibility she carried. He was a scientist. He dealt in evidence and measurable facts. So when the summons came, he had walked to her chamber with professional confidence, his medical scanner in one hand and his data pad in the other, ready to conduct a standard physical examination. He had not been ready for her. Celestina stood at the window of her chamber, and the first thing that struck Marcus was that she was smaller than he expected. The holographic projections that appeared at state functions showed her as imposing, 10 feet tall and ringed with circuitry of light. But in person, she was perhaps 5'6", slender to the point of fragility, and dressed in a simple robe of deep blue that seemed to absorb the starlight. Her hair was long and white, not the pale blonde of age but pure white, like frost or new snow. Her skin was luminous, almost translucent, and her eyes were the color of deep space, a blue so dark it was nearly black, flecked with something that caught the light like distant stars. She had not turned to face him at first. Instead, she had continued staring out at the cosmos while he entered, and Marcus had stood awkwardly in the doorway, uncertain of the protocol for this situation. Should he announce himself? Bow? He had never been good with formality. When she finally turned, he saw that her face was beautiful in a way that went beyond physical features. It was a beauty that seemed to contain sorrow and wisdom and something else he couldn't quite name, something like hunger but not for food or power, hunger for something intangible and perhaps unattainable. "Dr. Marcus Chen," she had said, and her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I read your file. You're from Earth originally, aren't you?" "Yes, Your Majesty," he had replied, falling back on formality because he didn't know what else to do. "Born in Shanghai, though I haven't been back in 15 years. Do you miss it?" The question seemed genuine, not the kind of polite making small talk that emperors engaged in. He had considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. But I was always meant for the stars." She had smiled at that, a small, sad smile. "Yes, I suppose you were. Come, I need you to run some tests. I've been experiencing some unusual symptoms." The symptoms turned out to be remarkable. Her blood work showed markers that shouldn't have been possible, biological mechanisms that seemed to operate on principles that contradicted basic medical science. Her cellular structure appeared to be maintained by some kind of process he could only describe as controlled regeneration, though the technology that maintained it was far beyond his understanding. He had spent hours running scans and taking samples, and throughout the process, she had asked him questions. Not questions about her health. Questions about him. Where he was from, what it was like growing up on Earth, whether he had family, what he loved to do. She asked about music and books and food and whether he believed in God. She asked about love and loss and hope. And while he answered, he became increasingly aware that he was not so much being interviewed as being truly listened to, something he rarely experienced even with people he had known for years. "You're different from the others," she had said finally, as he was packing up his equipment. "Different how?" he had asked. "You look at me. Most people, they look at the title or the crown or the power. They see the Empress. But you look at me like I'm a person. It's been a very long time since anyone did that." Over the following weeks, Marcus had been called to her chamber regularly. He would tell himself it was for follow-up examinations, for monitoring her unusual physiology. But the truth was that the examinations took less and less time and the conversations took more and more. She would ask him to sit with her while she worked through holographic displays of star charts and policy briefs. Sometimes she would ask his opinion on matters that affected millions of lives, and the most surprising part was that she seemed to genuinely value his thoughts. She told him about her life in pieces, gradually, like someone learning to trust again. She told him about being born on old Terra, before the sun had begun its death throes, before her people had spread out to the stars. She told him about rising to power not through ambition but through a series of circumstances and abilities that no one else possessed. She told him about the loneliness of command, about watching everyone you've ever known grow old and die while you continue unchanged. She told him about pushing people away because it hurt less than letting them close. She told him about the centuries she had spent in isolation, telling herself it was necessary, telling herself that leaders could not afford personal connections, telling herself so many lies until they had become indistinguishable from truth. "I thought I was protecting myself," she said one evening as they sat in her study, a vast chamber lined with windows that looked out onto the void. "But all I was doing was building a prison. The walls are so thick now, Dr. Chun, that I'm not sure I remember how to let anyone inside." It was that evening that he finally called her by her first name. "Celestina," he said gently, "you've let me inside. Aren't you noticing that nothing terrible has happened?" She had turned to look at him, and her eyes had glistened with unshed tears. "Something terrible might happen tomorrow. You might leave, or I might lose my grip on my sanity, or you might discover that you don't like what I really am beneath the title and the power." "Maybe," he had acknowledged, "but something good is happening right now. Shouldn't that matter more?" Over the weeks that followed, the line between professional and personal had blurred until it was barely perceptible. It wasn't a conscious crossing. Rather, it happened in small moments. A hand held longer than necessary. A conversation that lasted until dawn. A moment when she had laughed at something he said. A real laugh, unguarded and full of joy, and he had realized that he would have traveled across every galaxy in existence if it meant hearing that sound again. He had not meant to fall in love with her. It seemed impossible, absurd even. He was a 32-year-old human from a minor colony world. She was an immortal empress who commanded the loyalty of entire civilizations. The disparity in power and experience and lifespan was so vast that it should have made any kind of real connection impossible. And yet, somehow, it had happened anyway. The night he realized it, he was standing exactly where he stood now, at the viewport of the observation deck, watching the stars whirl past. He had been thinking about asking for a transfer back to his old post, because he couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep spending his nights in her chambers, listening to her breathe while she slept against his shoulder, pretending it wasn't tearing him apart to know it was temporary. He had a duty to himself, a responsibility to protect his own heart. The kindest thing he could do would be to leave before anyone got hurt. Before she got hurt. He had been so lost in thought that he hadn't noticed her approach until she spoke. "I thought I might find you here," Celestina said softly. He turned, and even after weeks of spending time together, the sight of her still took his breath away. She was wearing a simple white gown, and her hair hung loose down her back. She looked almost fragile, almost mortal, but her eyes held the weight of 2,000 years of existence. "I needed to think," he said, uncertain how to explain the conflict roiling inside him. She came to stand beside him, and they stood in silence for a long moment, watching the stars. "I know," she said finally. "You're thinking about leaving." He turned to her, startled. "How did you?" "I can read people. It's one of the few useful skills I've developed over the centuries. That and an excellent ability to compartmentalize emotion." She laughed, but it was bitter. "Or I thought I was good at it. Turns out I'm terrible. With you, I'm completely transparent." "Celestina." "Don't," she interrupted. "Let me say this, because if I don't say it now, I might not ever have the courage." She turned to face him fully. "I know this is impossible. I know that from a practical standpoint this shouldn't work. You'll grow old and I won't. You'll die and I'll remain. By every rational measure, the most logical thing would be for you to leave and find someone whose lifespan aligns with yours. Someone who can grow old beside you." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I'm asking you not to do that. Not because it's logical or right or anything other than selfish. I'm asking you to stay because I can't imagine going back to that isolation. I can't imagine facing another century, another millennium, of being alone." Marcus reached out and cupped her face gently in his hands. "I was going to ask you something similar. I was going to ask if you would let me stay. And I was terrified that you would say yes, because that would mean I had to accept that I'm signing up for eventual heartbreak. I can't promise you forever," she whispered. "I can only promise you now, however long now is." He kissed her then, there in that observation deck overlooking the infinite cosmos, and everything changed. Over the following months, they developed a rhythm together. During the day, there was still propriety to maintain. She ruled her empire, attended meetings with her councils, managed the thousands of details that kept civilization functioning across 40,000 star systems. He continued his duties as her physician, though the examinations became less frequent as her health seemed to stabilize. But in the evenings, when the doors to her private chambers closed, they were simply two people trying to navigate the impossible geography of their connection. He learned that she loved music, particularly ancient compositions from Earth. She had a collection of recordings of symphonies and operas, and would often ask him to play them while they worked or talked. She loved poetry and had read every significant work of literature ever produced by human civilization. She loved to cook, which surprised him, and would sometimes spend hours preparing meals from 100 different worlds, trying to recreate dishes she had tasted centuries ago. She also told him more about what it meant to be her, about the weight of command that never truly lifted. There was a specific technology that had extended her life indefinitely, a process that had been developed when she was young and had now become impossible to reverse. The immortality was not natural, nor was it something she had chosen as much as something that had been done to her with her compliance. And as the years turned to decades and the decades to centuries, she had begun to understand that immortality without purpose was its own form of death. "I had thought that ruling would be enough," she told him one night as they lay together in her bed, watching the stars slowly turn outside her window. "I had thought that if I focused entirely on that, on making my empire strong and just and prosperous, then the loneliness wouldn't matter. But loneliness doesn't work like that. compounds with time. It becomes a thing unto itself, a weight that nothing else can counterbalance. He held her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're not lonely now." "No," she agreed. "For now I'm not. But I'm terrified, Marcus. I'm terrified that this will end, and I'll have to go back. I'm terrified that every moment I spend with you is corrupting me, making me weaker, less able to do my job. And I'm terrified that I don't care anymore, that I would give it all up if you asked me to." "Don't say that," he replied gently. "You're the Empress. Your people need you. Your empire needs you." "I know," she said, and there was anguish in her voice. "That's what makes this so much harder. I want to choose you. I want to walk away from all of this and find some quiet planet where we could just be together, without the throne and the responsibility and the constant weight of billions of lives depending on my decisions. But I know I can't do that, and I know that staying will eventually corrupt what we have." Over the next several months, this concern became increasingly relevant. The more time they spent together, the more Celestina found herself distracted by matters of empire. She missed meetings. She delayed important decisions. Her council noticed. There were whispers, suggestions that perhaps the Empress was losing her faculties, that perhaps the burden of immortality was finally catching up with her and diminishing her mental capacity. Marcus could see the toll it was taking on her. There were new lines around her eyes, not from age but from stress. She slept poorly, often waking in the middle of the night with anxiety about some decision she had made or hadn't made, some person who depended on her judgment and was being let down. "It's not working," she said one evening, after she had made a critical error in policy that had upset the balance of trade agreements across 3 sectors. "I can't do both. I can't be the ruler my empire needs me to be and also be with you. Something has to give." Marcus felt his heart clench in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I need to think about what's best. Not for me, but for the billions of people whose lives depend on my decisions. They need an Empress who is fully committed, fully focused. They don't need an Empress who is distracted by love and romance and personal happiness." "So what, you want me to leave?" He couldn't keep the pain from his voice. "I don't know," she said, and she sounded so broken that he wanted to hold her, but something in her posture kept him away. "I don't know what the right thing to do is. I've been alive for so long, and I thought I had learned how to make difficult decisions without letting emotion cloud my judgment. But I've discovered that I'm not as strong as I thought I was. I'm weak. I'm vulnerable. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous for you and dangerous for everyone in my empire." They didn't reach a conclusion that night. Instead, they fell into an uncomfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the right thing was, whether it was possible for them to have what they wanted without sacrificing something crucial. The next morning, Marcus received a message. He had been reassigned. His new post would be on a research station orbiting Jupiter, studying the unique microorganisms that thrived in the upper atmosphere of the gas giant. The transfer was technically a promotion, a position that would normally be highly sought after. It would also take him to the far edge of the Empire's settled space, nearly impossible to reach from Celestina's court. He knew she had done it. The reassignment had the mark of her influence all over it. She was giving him an out, a way to leave gracefully without either of them having to make the explicit choice. He could tell himself that circumstances had changed, that fate had intervened, that he was moving on to better things. It was a lie, but it was a merciful one. He spent one last evening with her before his departure. They didn't talk about what had happened or what it meant. Instead, they simply held each other, committing the feel and smell and presence of the other to memory, knowing that this was likely the last time they would ever be together. "I love you," she whispered into his chest. I want you to know that, even though I'm letting you go, even though this is for the best, I love you. I love you too, he replied, and he felt tears running down his face. I'll always love you. He left before dawn, unable to bear watching her sleep and knowing that he would never see her like that again. The shuttle ride to the transfer station was endless. He stared out the window at the stars and tried not to think about the curve of her neck or the way she laughed or how her eyes looked when she was reading poetry and thought no one was watching her. For 2 years, Marcus threw himself into his work. The research station became his world. He discovered 17 new species of extremophile microorganisms and co-authored 17 papers on their biology and potential applications for interstellar medicine. He was productive and focused, and by all external measures he was thriving. But internally he was dying by slow degrees. Every sunrise reminded him of watching the sunrise from her observation deck. Every piece of music he heard made him think of the compositions she loved. Every night, he would lie awake and calculate how long she had been alive and how many more centuries she might live, and the knowledge that he would be dead long before she joined him was a constant ache beneath his skin. He never tried to contact her. He assumed that she had moved on, found equilibrium between the demands of her empire and her personal life, probably with someone else. Someone more suitable, someone more able to handle the complexities of loving an immortal empress. So when the summons came, 2 years to the day after he had left, he almost didn't believe it. The message arrived in the form of a priority communication from the imperial palace. He was instructed to take immediate leave from his post and return to the flagship Eternum. The message was brief and official and gave no indication of why his presence was required. He had 1,000 thoughts as he packed his belongings. Was she ill? Had something happened to her? Was she calling him back only to reject him all over again, to confirm that their time together had been a mistake? The journey back took 3 weeks, and Marcus spent all of them in a state of agitated anticipation. He practiced conversations in his head, rehearsed explanations and apologies and declarations. By the time he arrived at the Eternum, he was wrung out and exhausted and terrified. He was escorted directly to her chambers without being given time to change out of his traveling clothes or even shower. The guards left him at her door, and he stood for a long moment before he was brave enough to enter. She was standing at the window, exactly as she had been the first time he had come to her chambers, looking out at the infinite expanse of space. But something was different. She seemed diminished somehow, older in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance. Her shoulders were curved inward as if she was folding in on herself. When she turned to face him, her eyes were red and swollen from crying. "Marcus," she said, and his name in her voice was like a physical blow. "Thank you for coming." "Of course I came," he replied. "Your Majesty, what's happened? Are you hurt? Is something wrong?" "No," she said, and then she laughed, a sound without any humor in it. "Or yes, everything is wrong, and I have no one to blame but myself. I made a terrible mistake 2 years ago, and I've spent every day since then trying to convince myself that it was the right one. And I can't anymore. I can't do it anymore." He moved toward her slowly, carefully, as if she might shatter if he moved too quickly. "What do you mean?" "I thought I could go back to how I was before you," she said, and her voice broke. "I thought that if I just focused on the empire, if I just threw myself into the work and tried hard enough, that the loneliness would become manageable again, that I would accept it like I always have. But it didn't work. The loneliness became worse, not better. I had tasted what it was like to be seen, truly seen by another person, and going back to isolation was like trying to exist in a room with no light." "Celestina," he started, but she held up a hand. "Wait, let me finish. I know that it's unfair to call you back here. I know that you've moved on, that you have a good life, a promising career, that you're probably thriving without me dragging you down with my impossible situation. But I was dying without you. Not literally, because I am, unfortunately, biologically incapable of the mercy of that. But I was dying in every way that matters. And tonight, I realize that I've been selfish my entire life. I've been taking and never giving back. And the one time I tried to be noble, to do what was best for someone else, all it accomplished was making both of us miserable. So I'm being selfish again. I'm calling you back. And I'm asking you to stay with me, not for a prescribed term, not for as long as it works out logistically, but truly stay. Stay with me for whatever time you have. Make me promises that you might not be able to keep. Let me love you without the constant shadow of impending departure. Marcus crossed the room in quick strides and pulled her into his arms. I never moved on, he said. I tried. God, I tried so hard. But I couldn't. I don't think I ever will. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if she needed to confirm that this was real. How is that possible? I let you go. I released you from your duties. I know, he said. But you can't just turn off love like it's a switch. You can't convince your heart that it doesn't matter anymore, even if your brain knows that it's supposed to. I spent 2 years telling myself that what we had was just a moment in time, that it was always going to end, that I was being foolish and sentimental and impractical. But none of that changed the fact that I missed you so much it hurt to breathe. I've been so stupid, Celestina said, tears streaming down her face. I had so much time, and I wasted it. I could have been with you instead of... She broke off, unable to continue. You did what you thought was right, he said gently. And maybe it was right. Maybe we both needed that time apart to figure out that this is what we really want. But we can't waste any more time. Not now. He kissed her then, with all the passion and longing that 2 years of separation had built up inside him. And she kissed him back, desperately, like she was afraid he would vanish if she let him go. They fell into her bed without bothering to move to the bedroom properly, tangling together on the couch in her sitting room, hands grasping and mouths seeking. For a long time they didn't speak. They were too busy rediscovering each other, relearning the map of each other's bodies, the small sounds each made, the way they fit together like puzzle pieces designed specifically for one another. Later, much later, they lay tangled together, and Celestina spoke softly against his chest. I want to do something, she said. Something I haven't done in centuries. I want to leave the palace. Not forever, but for a while. I want to go somewhere quiet and private. Somewhere that isn't filled with the weight of empire and responsibility. I want to have time with you without someone needing something or someone planning something or events requiring my presence. Is that selfish? Maybe a little, he said, and he felt her laugh against his skin. But I think you deserve it. How long are you thinking? As long as we want, she said. I have capable people running things. My cabinet has been testing their wings, so to speak, and they've been doing a decent job. I've been micromanaging because I didn't know how to do anything else, because I was afraid that without me, everything would collapse. But I'm beginning to think that maybe that's not true. Maybe I've built something strong enough that it can survive without my constant attention. Where would you want to go? He asked, already thinking about logistics, about how they could manage to leave without triggering a political crisis. There's a place, she said. A private retreat that was built centuries ago, on a moon in the Vela system. It's far enough from the settled worlds that we wouldn't be disturbed, but close enough that we could return quickly if there was a genuine emergency. No one has used it in over 100 years. I don't think I've even been there since I was much younger. I'd like to go there with you. Then let's go, he said simply. Over the following week, they made preparations. The cover story was that the Empress required a period of isolation for medical and spiritual rejuvenation. Her cabinet was informed that she would be unreachable for a month, but that they were to handle routine matters and escalate anything truly critical to the secondary command structure. It was a small departure from normal protocol, but not unprecedented, and the cabinet seemed relieved to have a legitimate reason to exercise more authority. Marcus, meanwhile, sent a message to his superior at the research station, requesting a personal leave of absence. Given his sudden summons by the Empress, no one questioned it. The journey to the Vela system took 5 days by fast transport. Throughout the journey, Marcus watched Celestina change. With each jump through space, with each light year they put between themselves and the Empire, he could see her shoulders relax and the tension ease out of her face. She stopped checking her secure communications terminal. She stopped reviewing policy briefs. She began to smile more and worry less, and he fell more deeply in love with her every day. The retreat itself was built into the surface of a small moon, designed to take advantage of naturally occurring thermal vents for geothermal energy. It was a marvel of architecture, a beautiful blend of function and aesthetics, with sprawling gardens maintained by ancient automated systems that had been running for so long that they had become part of the ecosystem. There were libraries filled with physical books, a privilege that required immense resources to maintain. There were music rooms with instruments from 100 different worlds. There were private beaches overlooking an inland sea that had existed in equilibrium for millennia. And there were bedrooms, many bedrooms, but they only used one. The first few days they barely left the retreat at all. They made love and slept and woke and made love again, rediscovering each other completely. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams and the small details of their lives that you only share with people you trust completely. He told her about his childhood in Shanghai, about the morning he decided to leave Earth forever. She told him about the day she realized she was going to live forever, how she had wept and raged and eventually accepted it as simply the way things were. On the 4th day, they ventured out into the gardens. They walked hand in hand through rows of impossible flowers that bloomed in impossible colors, through groves of trees that sang in the wind, past fountains that reflected the starlight in prismatic patterns. They sat by the edge of the inland sea and watched creatures that looked like a cross between fish and birds leap through the water and briefly achieve flight before diving back down. "I've been thinking about something," Celestina said as they sat watching the sunset, which was rendered in shades of purple and green because of the unique atmospheric composition of the moon. "What's that?" he asked, his arm around her shoulders. "About us and the future. I know we can't stay here forever. Eventually, I have to return to my throne and resume my duties. But I was thinking, what if we didn't have to go back to the way things were before? What if there was a way to keep this, to keep what we have, while also meeting my responsibilities? How would we do that?" he asked, curious. "You would stay with me," she said. "Not as my physician, though you could maintain that role if you wanted, but as my consort. I could legitimize it formally, make it part of the structure of my rule. You would have a position of authority, which would give you a reason to be at my side at all times without it seeming strange. And we could build a life together, slowly, carefully, in a way that doesn't destabilize my empire or compromise my ability to rule." He was quiet for a long moment, processing what she was suggesting. "Are you proposing to me? Is that what you want?" she asked. "Because I'm afraid I'm not very good at romance or traditional proposals. I can rule over star systems, but I don't know how to do the little things that make moments memorable. I don't know how to make this feel special the way it should." "You just did," he said. He took her hand and kissed her palm, and he felt her breath catch. Yes, I want to stay with you. Yes, I want to build a life with you. Yes to everything." They returned to the capital 3 weeks later, and the announcement that the Empress had taken a consort created immediate upheaval in the political sphere. There were those who saw it as a sign of weakness, a distraction from her duties. There were others who saw it as an opportunity to push their own agendas. There were still others who seemed to think it was romantic, who were pleased that the legendary lonely Empress had finally found someone to share her burden. The first few months were difficult. There were factions within the government that opposed the Union, that whispered about manipulation and questioned the origins of Marcus's sudden elevation from physician to consort. They wanted to investigate his background, to ensure he didn't have ties to any political rival, to confirm that his presence wouldn't destabilize the careful balance of power that had been maintained for centuries. Celestina handled it with the efficiency of someone who had been dealing with political opposition for millennia. She made it clear that Marcus's role was non-negotiable. She established protocols for his security and authority, made it known that any attempt to undermine him would be considered an attempt to undermine her. Within 6 months, most of the opposition had been neutralized or had at least accepted the situation as an unchangeable fact. But not everyone was placated. There remained a contingent of conservative elements within the government who viewed the entire situation with suspicion and hostility. They watched for mistakes, for signs that Celestina's judgment had been compromised by her personal feelings. The opportunity came when a crisis erupted in the outer territories. A faction that had been growing in power for years suddenly made an aggressive move against one of the neighboring sector governors. It was a calculated risk by someone who had clearly been waiting for a moment when they thought Celestina's attention might be divided. The response required swift and decisive action. Celestina had to coordinate military forces, negotiate with multiple factions, and make decisions that would affect millions of lives. It was exactly the kind of high-pressure situation where any sign of weakness or distraction could be catastrophic. Marcus made the decision to step back. He essentially moved out of her personal quarters and into a separate set of chambers. He reduced the amount of time they spent together to only formal state functions and late-night meetings when she was too exhausted to maintain any pretense of distance. He accepted invitations to other planets, undertook diplomatic missions, and generally made himself scarce. It was one of the most difficult things he had ever done. They would pass each other in the halls of the palace, and it would take all of his self-control not to reach out and touch her. He would sit through official dinners and watch her speak with such intelligence and authority, and he would remember why he had fallen in love with her in the first place, and it would hurt all over again. During this period, Celestina was brilliant. She coordinated the military response with surgical precision, she mediated between the conflicting factions with diplomatic finesse, and she ultimately forced the aggressive faction to stand down and accept new territorial boundaries that were actually more favorable to the surrounding sectors. It was a masterclass in crisis management, and every observer noted that the Empress seemed sharper and more focused than she had been in decades. But Marcus could see the toll it was taking on her. When they occasionally found themselves alone, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. She had thrown herself back into the old patterns of complete isolation and absolute focus, and while it had worked, while it had solved the crisis, it had also reinforced the idea that maybe she had been right all along, that maybe love and empire were fundamentally incompatible. When it was over, when the crisis had been resolved and the media had moved on to other stories, she called him back to her private chambers. He found her sitting at her window, looking small and exhausted, still wearing the formal regalia from the final diplomatic negotiations. "I was wrong," she said without preamble. "I was wrong about us. I thought that by stepping back, by giving you space and distance, I could prove that you weren't a distraction. But all I did was prove that I don't know how to be the kind of person who can have both power and love. I don't know how to be a whole person instead of just being an empress." He moved to her and helped her out of her formal clothes, then wrapped her in a simple robe and held her. "You're wrong about that too," he said. "You managed the entire crisis just fine while we were together. The problem wasn't that I was distracting you. The problem is that you've spent so long believing that you don't deserve happiness that you sabotage yourself whenever you start to have it." "How do you fix that?" she asked. "How do I fix 2,000 years of believing I'm supposed to suffer alone?" "Slowly," he said. "One day at a time. With help. With people who love you and won't let you talk yourself into isolation again." Over the next year, they learned to navigate the complicated balance of power and love. There were ups and downs, moments when it seemed like it might not work, times when the demands of her position threatened to overwhelm any personal happiness they had managed to carve out for themselves. But they worked through it together. Marcus became more active in advisory roles, using his medical expertise and his outsider perspective to contribute meaningfully to policy decisions. His presence began to be seen not as a distraction but as an asset, another point of view that could contribute to better outcomes. Celestina learned to set boundaries, to establish times that were protected for their personal relationship, and to trust her cabinet to handle things without her micromanaging every decision. They also built a small sanctuary within the palace, a private chamber where no official business was conducted. It became their refuge, a place where the Empress and her consort could simply be two people together without the weight of empire pressing down on them. 2 years into their official union, Celestina proposed another journey to the retreat in the Vela system. This time, she didn't frame it as an escape from her duties, but as a legitimate state leave, something that was widely announced and officially scheduled. They spent a full month there, and when they returned, she made an announcement that shocked the entire political establishment. She was establishing a formal succession plan. For millennia, she had been the sole point of authority, the central pillar around which the entire empire rotated. The idea of anyone else ever holding the throne had been unthinkable, almost blasphemous. But as she grew older, as she contemplated a future that might extend for another 1,000 years or more, she came to understand that no single person should hold that kind of absolute power indefinitely. She appointed a council of regents who would be capable of taking control in case of emergency, and she established a constitutional framework that would allow for the transition of power if she ever decided to step down. More importantly, she established a retirement provision, a formal mechanism by which she could, at any point, transfer control and step away from the throne if she decided that was what she wanted to do. The move was hailed by progressive factions as a necessary modernization, and was viewed with deep suspicion by conservatives who had benefited from the absolute stability of her rule. But Celestina was firm, and gradually, over the course of several months, the new structure was integrated into the operations of the empire. 5 years after that first reunion, Marcus sat with her at that same observation deck where he had stood watching the stars so many times before. She rested her head against his shoulder, and they watched the Andromeda galaxy rotate slowly in the distance, the same as it had rotated countless times in her long existence. "I've been thinking about something," she said, and he recognized this phrase now as her signal that she had reached a significant decision. "I want to go back to Earth." "To Earth?" he asked, surprised. "You haven't been there in centuries." "No," she agreed. "I haven't. But I was thinking you grew up there. There are things there that were important to you, people probably, places with meaning. And I've spent so much time running from my past, from my origins, that I never bothered to learn about yours. I want to know where you come from. I want to walk where you walked as a child. I want to see Earth the way you saw it." They went together, leaving the empire in the capable hands of her cabinet. They traveled as private citizens, using the identities that most advanced humans maintained for exactly this kind of purpose. It was strange for both of them, but particularly for Celestina, who had defined herself for so long by her role and her authority. They visited Shanghai, and Marcus showed her the neighborhood where he had grown up. The building where his apartment had been was gone, replaced centuries ago by new construction. But the neighborhood itself had a continuity to it, streets that had maintained their essential character across multiple centuries of change. They ate at restaurants that had been in continuous operation for over 100 years. They walked along the river, watching the sun set behind the skyscrapers, and Marcus told her stories about his childhood, about the boy he had been before he decided to leave Earth forever. She listened with complete attention, the way she had listened when they first met, giving him her entire focus. And in that moment he realized something fundamental. She was not just the Empress anymore. She was Celestina, a person who had chosen him, who had chosen love, and who was learning, slowly but genuinely, how to be happy. They visited other places. They went to the ruins of ancient cities, to museums where the history of human civilization was preserved in artifacts and recordings. They sat in concert halls and listened to music played by living orchestras. They ate food prepared fresh by chefs working with raw ingredients rather than synthesized alternatives. They experienced Earth the way only tourists could, with the wonder and freshness of people seeing something for the first time, even though at least one of them had seen it before. When they finally returned to the palace, Celestina seemed different. She had found something in that journey, some part of herself that she had lost centuries ago, and she had brought it back with her. Slowly, over the next several years, she began to delegate more authority. Her council of regents grew stronger. She stepped back from daily decisions and focused instead on long-term vision and strategic planning. She began to talk about the possibility of eventually stepping down, not immediately, but at some point in the future when she had ensured that the empire could survive without her. The idea was revolutionary. An immortal empress stepping down was almost incomprehensible. But she was serious about it, and over time, the idea began to seem less impossible and more like an aspiration for enlightened governance. Marcus and Celestina grew old together in the way that only they could. He aged, his hair turned gray, his face lined with the years, his body gradually becoming frilier. She remained essentially unchanged, but her soul seemed to age, accumulating wisdom and peace and acceptance in a way that had nothing to do with the passage of physical time. They talked about his eventual death. It was a difficult conversation, one that neither of them wanted to have, but necessary nonetheless. They made peace with it, to the extent that anyone could make peace with such an inevitable loss. They talked about how she would handle it, how she would move forward, what she might do after he was gone. "I'll have had something that most people never get," she said to him in the later years of his life. "I had love. Real, genuine, transformative love. And I'll have had it for decades. That's more than most people get in a full lifetime, and I'm going to be lucky enough to have had it multiple times my lifespan. I don't think I have the right to ask for more than that." But as his health inevitably began to decline, as his body started to show the signs of human mortality catching up with him, the weight of losing him began to press on her more and more. She began to ask questions that had no good answers. Could she extend his life using the same technology that had extended hers? Could they give him the same immortality that had been forced upon her? "No," he said gently when she raised the question. "I don't want that. Celestina, I've had a wonderful life, and a significant portion of that has been because of you. But I don't want immortality. I don't want to spend thousands of years watching the universe unfold. I want my life to have an ending, and I want that ending to give my time with you meaning. If I had forever, then no single moment would be precious. It would just be one of infinite moments. But because I have a limited amount of time, every moment matters. Every conversation, every sunset we watch together, Every morning I wake up next to you. All of it matters more because it's temporary." She understood intellectually, but understanding didn't make it easier. In the final year of his life, they went back to the retreat in the Vela system one more time. They sat by the inland sea where they had watched the sunset the evening she had proposed to him. They watched the sunset again, rendered in the same purple and green hues, and he held her while she cried. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for coming back to me that second time. Thank you for giving me another chance. Thank you for everything." "Thank you," he replied, "for letting me in, for trusting me with your heart, even though you were terrified, for learning to believe that you deserved happiness, for all of it." He died quietly, in his sleep, in the bed they had shared for so many years. She held him through the night and into the morning, and when she finally let him go, it was with the knowledge that she had loved him and had been loved in return, and that was enough. It had to be enough. After his death, Celestina stepped back from the throne completely. She didn't abdicate formally, but rather she transitioned into a purely ceremonial role, leaving all practical authority to her council of regents. She spent months in mourning, in isolation, working through the grief that had threatened to consume her the moment he died. But as the weeks turned to months and the months turned to years, she found that she didn't descend back into the old patterns of hopeless loneliness. Instead, she found that his memory sustained her. When she was tempted to retreat into complete isolation, she would think about what he had taught her about opening her heart. When she wanted to give up on her reforms and return to absolute rule, she would remember how proud he had been when she had established the new constitutional framework. Years passed, and she gradually learned to live with his absence. She established a scholarship in his name, dedicated to advancing interstellar medicine. She created a private library that housed all of his research papers and personal writings. She continued to visit the retreat in the Vela system and would sit by the inland sea and talk to him, sharing the events of her life with someone who could no longer hear her, but whom she could not bear to stop speaking to. Decades after his death, she was sitting at the observation deck of a new flagship, watching a different galaxy rotate past, when one of her remaining advisors approached her. "Your Majesty," the advisor said, "the Regent's Council would like to present you with a formal request." "What is it?" she asked, not turning from the viewport. "They believe the Empire is now stable enough and sufficiently advanced in terms of governance that you could step down from the throne entirely. Your presence has become more of a symbolic anchor than a practical necessity. They're asking if you would consider formal abdication and retirement." She was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. 1,000 years ago, such a suggestion would have seemed absurd, impossible. But 1,000 years ago, she had been alone, and she had believed that her presence was the only thing holding her empire together. She turned to face the advisor. "Tell them yes. Tell them I will abdicate in 1 year, on the anniversary of the establishment of the constitutional framework. And tell them I have a proposal for what I would like to do after that." The advisor looked surprised. "What would that be, Your Majesty?" "I want to go back to Earth," she said. "I want to establish a research foundation dedicated to finding new ways to extend and improve human life. I want to work directly with scientists and doctors and researchers. I want to spend my remaining years, however many that might be, doing something tangible and positive for the people who make up my empire. I want to do something that Marcus would have been proud of." The advisor bowed respectfully. "I will convey your wishes to the council." 1 year later, in a ceremony that was broadcast across 40,000 star systems, Empress Celestina formally abdicated the throne. Her regents assumed full authority, and she stepped down from the position she had held for over 2,000 years. In her abdication speech, which became instantly historic, She spoke about the nature of power and responsibility, about the importance of knowing when to let go, about the transformative power of love. She spoke about Marcus, though not by name, about how one person had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She spoke about learning that immortality was only a curse if you spent it alone, and that the greatest gift you could give yourself or anyone else was connection, genuine connection with another human being. After the speech, she disappeared from public view. The Empire assumed that she had retired to one of her private estates to live out her remaining years in quiet contemplation. In reality, she had done something far more radical. She had begun the process of looking for other immortals, other beings who had been extended beyond their natural lifespan by the same technology that had extended hers. She found them scattered across the galaxy, most of them as isolated and desperate as she had been. She brought them together and established a community, a place where they could support each other through the unique challenges of immortality. She called it the Last Light Foundation, in honor of the way Marcus had been her light in the darkness. She worked there for the next several centuries, helping other immortals find meaning and connection and purpose. She helped them establish relationships with mortal humans, and she created frameworks for how those relationships could be sustained despite the massive disparity in lifespan. She helped them transition from roles of absolute power to roles of service and support. She helped them understand that their immortality was not a curse to be endured in isolation but a gift that could be used to help others. Generations passed. The original regents grew old and were succeeded by their children and their children's children. The empire continued to evolve and grow. New technologies were developed, new worlds were settled, new challenges emerged and were overcome. Through it all, Celestina remained, a living connection to the past, a reminder that change was possible, that power could be wielded with wisdom and compassion, that an immortal being could choose to use their time on something other than the endless accumulation of authority. She was no longer the Empress. She was simply Celestina, and she was surrounded by people who valued her not for her position but for who she was as a person. She had learned, finally, what it meant to be loved for yourself rather than for your power, and that knowledge had transformed her existence from a curse into something approaching grace. Years turned into decades, turned into centuries. Celestina lived to see species rise and fall across the known universe. She lived through wars and peacetime, advancement and occasional regression, the endless cycle of civilizations rising and falling like waves on an ocean. But through it all, she maintained the foundation, and she maintained the memory of Marcus, and she maintained the belief that even in the face of cosmic indifference and the vast impersonal movements of history, individual human connection mattered. On a quiet evening, sitting by the inland sea on that moon in the Vela system where she had proposed to him all those centuries ago, Celestina reflected on what her life had become. She had ruled an empire for 2,000 years. She had shaped the history of human civilization. She had accumulated power beyond measure. But the thing she was most proud of, the thing that had given her life meaning in a way that no amount of power ever could, was that she had loved and been loved in return. She had let someone in. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable and broken and in desperate need of another person. And in doing so, she had discovered that she had always been human, even when she had believed she had transcended humanity entirely. The retreat was quiet, as it always was. The flowers in the garden bloomed in their impossible colors. The fountain reflected the starlight in prismatic patterns. The creature that looked like a cross between a fish and a bird dove and flew and dove again in the waters of the inland sea. And Celestina, who had ruled empires and commanded billions, who had been alive for more than 3,000 years, who had been given the gift and curse of immortality, sat with a cup of tea and a book and thought about a man who had been mortal and flawed and beautiful and kind, and who had taught her everything about what it meant to truly live. The stars rotated overhead, indifferent to the small dramas of human existence, as they always had and always would. But beneath those stars, in that quiet retreat on that small moon, an immortal empress had found what trillions of beings throughout history had searched for. She had found home. She had found peace. She had found love. And in that finding, she had discovered that immortality was not about the endless continuation of existence. It was about the moments that transcended time, the connections that mattered more than any accumulation of years. It was about the way a single person could transform your entire understanding of what it meant to be alive. The sun set behind the moon, rendering the sky in purple and green, the same colors it had always rendered, the same colors it would render 1,000 years from now, long after Celestina herself had finally decided that she had lived long enough and had chosen her own ending. But that choice was in the distant future, a luxury that no one else could afford. For now, in this moment, she was simply here, watching the sunset, feeling the wind on her face, remembering the man she had loved so many years ago. And in that remembrance, he lived on, transforming her continued existence from a prison into something approaching grace. The story of Celestina and Marcus would echo through the ages, told and retold, transformed into legend and myth. Lovers would find their story and wonder if such connection was possible. Immortals would find her foundation and discover that they didn't have to spend eternity alone. Mortals would listen to their tale and understand that the time they had was precious beyond measure. But the story itself, the real story, belonged to only two people. It belonged to an empress who learned that power without connection was empty, and to a doctor who gave his finite life to help an infinite being discover what it meant to truly live. And that story, written in the hearts and minds of everyone who had known them or been touched by their legacy, would endure long after the stars themselves had burned out and the universe had spiraled into entropy. Because love, genuine love, transformative love, was the only thing that survived forever. It was the only thing that mattered when all else crumbled into dust. And on a quiet moon in a distant system, an immortal empress would remember that truth every single day, for as long as she existed.